and welcome to the Cube Vanguard. If I look frustrated, well, then I am. I've recorded this about 3 or 4 times, I can't remember how many, and each time there's been some catastrophic error which has stopped me from continuing. The first issue was that today's January 7th, and I went out this morning, Sunday, did my exercise, which I normally do, and I do them outside because it's nice, fresh air, the birds and stuff. And we got our first big snowstorm yesterday. What I normally do when it's snowing, winter, is I put on 2 pairs of socks, 1 thermal pair. But because I was still in summer mode, because we hadn't any sun, we hadn't any sun either for a long time, but we haven't any snow, to speak of since last year, I went out normally with my 1 pair of socks. Not a good idea, because when you're doing your workout, you don't really notice it, but your feet are getting cold, which means you get a runny nose later. You're not sick, it's just annoyance, and then later it'll go away, but still. But it does also make your brain a bit fuzzy. So my brain was a bit fuzzy. And I made a couple of mistakes here and there, so I had to redo it. And then the last one was going perfectly, and guess what? My internet went down, and I couldn't grab my the images from the internet that I was using for my show. Anyways, that's what happens in life. You have to scramble sometimes. What are we talking about today? We're talking about services in Kubernetes. Services. Now, this is one of those areas where you have to be careful, because if you're just a regular IT person who hasn't done any Kubernetes before, you'd think, okay, services, like services in Windows, services in Linux, but it's not the same thing. Services in Kubernetes is the networking part, okay? It's what exposes your pods to other pods or outside. This is how you get to them, through services. And I'm going to talk about that right now. So first comes to first, and we'll do a little demo too. And don't feel bad if you don't get it right away. It took me a long time to understand all the bits and pieces, but it'll eventually come to you. But I'm going to do a very kind of basic overview just to get people used to the idea. So services, think networking, think exposing applications, pods, whatnot. Okay, so as always, I always like to go to the documentation. Oh, and that's great documentation, isn't it? You can't see a thing. Let's, this one, see, it's very confusing, as you can see right now. Let me open my Vivaldi. It's one of those days. Sometimes things just don't work, and so you have to kind of like wing it. So come on, Vivaldi. There's Vivaldi. Is that showing up in my little window? Yes, it is. Oh, and it came to the right location, too. That's awfully nice. Okay, so here's Vivaldi, and here is web browser I use for my shows, and the services page. So again, always go to the Kubernetes documentation, not just because it's excellent, but also because they keep it up to date. In every version of Kubernetes that comes out, there could be changes. So talking about services, there are 4 main types. So let's go look at them. And they do different things. So before we go down and take a look at them, let me explain what they are. So the first one's called cluster IP. And the way I always think is cluster IP, it's IP in the cluster, and then it reminds me that it can only be contacted inside a cluster. So if you have an application and you give it a service, right, and it's a cluster IP service, which is the default one, right? So if you just create a service, that's what it's going to be, then it can only be contacted inside of your Kubernetes cluster. And you'll say, well, why is that? I mean, on a VM, if I create an application, it just gets the IP address of the VM. Okay, think of it this way. What if you have an application, okay, and it's got a front end, and it's got a back end or a number of back end pods of databases and whatnot? The only thing that needs to be seen outside of the Kubernetes cluster is that front end, right? The user might have put some input or something like that, or if it's a web page, you want to see it. But the databases and things behind it, they just need to be able to talk to that front end. So there's no reason to expose them. So hence, they can have just cluster IP for their services. It's a good example. All right. You also have a service called node port. And again, the way you can see it is this. We look at the names, cluster IP. Think of only in the cluster. Node port. It's a port on a node. So you might have one node, you'd have multiple nodes. What this does is assigns a static port on each node to your application, okay? And you say, well, that's great. I'll use that all the time. Not good to use production. I'll tell you why. Because the static port that it gives has to be over 30,000, the number. If you don't assign one, it'll automatically assign one for you, which I'll show in a second. And it's going to be some huge, like 31,000 or something like that. And you have to put that in the URL. So you'd have to put your IP address or your URL and then colon 30,000 something. No one wants to do that. So not a good thing to use. And also for updating things, not very useful. But it's great for testing, okay? And then there is the load balancer. Okay, and the load balancer, what's that going to do? Well, if you make it a service load balancer type, it's going to reach out to a load balancer and say, hey, give me an external IP address for the network. So if you're in Azure or if you're in AWS, they have load balancers there. If you put type service load balancer, it will grab an IP address, which can then be accessed from outside. Keep in mind, though, they charge for that. If you're in an on-premise Kubernetes, you can use something like Metal LB inside your cluster, which is a load balancer, and you assign it some external IP addresses, and then it'll just give them out one by one to your applications that ask for it, okay? The last type that we've got, and I'll show you them in a second right here, is called external name. And to make this one very simple, just think that you have an application outside of your Kubernetes cluster. It's not on Kubernetes. It's, let's say, a database on a VM. But you want your applications in Kubernetes to be able to get to it easily. So you can give it an external name service, and then they'll be able to reach it. So let's look at the official documentation to see what they say, because I talk in Jeff language, which I hope is simplified, but this is more advanced, obviously. So service types down here. Just concentrate on that for now, because that's the first kind of thing you want to think about. So here we go. Cluster IP exposes the service on a cluster internal IP. There you go. Node port exposes the service on each node's IP at a static port. Just as I said. The load balancer exposes the service externally using an external load balancer. And last but not least, external name maps the service to the contents of the external name field. And the mapping configures your cluster's DNS server to return a CNAME record with that external hostname value. No proxying of any kind is set up, okay? So there you go. Remember those first services and remember what they do. And now to make things even simpler, I'm going to give a little demo of how this works. Very easy to do all the stuff. Now I'm using Rancher Desktop on my Windows laptop, and I'm leveraging on my Windows laptop, as you all know, Windows subsystem for Linux, okay? So what I'm going to do, let's create a pod with Nginx, a nice little static web browser. So I'm going to do krun Nginx, and image is Nginx, okay? And that should create for me I already created it. Isn't that nice? It's already created. Let's go check it out, see if it's working. Last time it wasn't, by the way. This was the problem. It was reaching out and it was getting a image error, fail, back off, whatever. And that's when it can't, my internet was down basically. So, okay, no, it's running. That's great. Okay, so Nginx. But right now, how am I going to get to that? Or how is any pod inside of the cluster to get to it? Well, you can go directly to the pod itself. But remember, one of the important things about Kubernetes is you can restart pods all the time. It's made to be self-healing. It can restart pods. Well, when you restart a pod, it's going to get a new IP address. So if I was to do this, so I can do kpod or get pod, and I'm going to do O-wide. This is another little trick you can do. This will actually show me that my Nginx pod does have an IP address, right? So Jeff, just use that, just like a VM. But again, these can be restarted, these pods, okay? If you have a deployment, you might have scaled the deployment to 5 pods. Well, that every time you restart it, that IP address is going to change. That's no good. So the service is outside of that so that you don't have to worry. Those IP addresses internally, those pods internally can be restarted. All sorts of stuff can happen to them, but the service will be the same. So let's create a service. And of course, you can always create things with YAML files declaratively, and that's what you're supposed to do it. But I'm just going to use the imperative command just to prove my point. So the imperative command would be k. Well, again, and I'm saying k, remember, it's kubectl or kubectl, but I'm using the alias in Linux, which makes things easier. I don't want to type kubectl. I'm lazy, so I'm using k. K expose, what I'm exposing, in this case, a pod. It could have been deployment. What if there's a deployment? I could do that, or replica set, but this is going to be a pod that you saw. And which pod? Well, it's Nginx. Okay, and what's important is what port? Well, I know that Nginx works on port 80, and then target port is the port on the, so that's what's going to expose the port 80, but on the actual pod, it's going to be also port 80. And these things can be different, but I don't want to go too deep into that right now. Let's just make them the same because that's fine. And what this will do is create a service for my pod. So now, if my pod restarts, it doesn't matter because I can still get to it through this service. Okay, the IP address might change on the pod, but the service is the same. What type of service is this? Were you listening? Yes, it's a cluster IP service, which means it can be only reached inside the cluster. So as you see, there's my service Nginx, and it is a cluster IP service. Now, good question, which someone might have thought of, well, Jeff, I don't get this because if I had a VM, okay, my Nginx is on the VM. Let's say Nginx, you can install it on Linux, and there's the IP address. That's fine. But here you've got these different components. You've got a service and you've got a pod. How does that service go to that pod? Because what if you have a lot of pods and a lot of services? So the way Kubernetes does this, and I guess for VMware folks, it's a little bit more, well, you got to be careful with comparisons, but tagging, whatnot, not quite that, but still. What it uses are labels and selectors. So when I created my Nginx pod, I just did a K run, called it Nginx, and then image Nginx. It automatically created some labels. So let's go take a look at that. K describe pod, describe it, Nginx. And we're going to see that when this was created, it created a pod with a label. And there it is, labels run equals Nginx. Okay, so you see that, equal Nginx. Nginx. So the service is going to point to that through a selector, okay? And it has to be exact same one, and that way it knows that this is what it's representing. So now let's do a K describe service Nginx. Describe is a wonderful command in Kubernetes. It tells you all sorts of information. So we're going to do K describe. And what do we see in the selector? We see run equals Nginx, okay? So whatever is this service's selector is the application, the pod, or the deployment it's going to be going to, okay, or whatever. So keep that in mind. So that's how it connects up. All right, great. So this can only be contacted now inside the cluster. Now, why don't I prove that? So let's create a second pod. We're going to K run. We're going to call this Nginx2. It's going to be image equals Nginx. Okay, that'll create a second Nginx pod. And we're going to go inside of that pod and then curl the service to prove that inside of the cluster it can be seen. Let's make sure that's up and running. Yes, it's up and running. So now, how do we get inside a pod? Well, first of all, the pod, to get inside, it has to have certain things in there. For instance, some pods don't. Nginx does have bash, so you can get a command line inside the pod. Others will have containers that don't have that. So let's just do that. Let's go k-exe into pod. Let's be Nginx. Oops, I don't need the pod part. Nginx 2. And don't worry too much about this part. This is basically just how you get inside a pod, just to prove my point. And we're executing into the pod. So I'm now inside that second pod we created. Isn't this fun? Now, what is the service's IP address? Okay, this is the thing that's not going to change. So you can see here it's 10.43.82.238. So let's curl that and see what happens. 10.43, 182.238. Boom. What do we see? We see welcome to Nginx. It's command line, so it's not very pretty, but you get the drift. Body HTML, thank you for using Nginx. Okay, great. But what happens if excuse me for a second, this might work out in the snow. Affected my nose this morning. What happens if we go, let's say, to our Vivaldi, all right, our Vivaldi web browser and try to look at that service, okay? So I'm using Windows subset for Linux, so it's all going to come onto the loopback address, should theoretically, but it won't now. So here we are. Let's go to here. Let's open another tab and let's type the loopback address just to show that there's nothing that it can reach. And not found. Now I also have an Nginx controller in there, Nginx controller, but that's something separate when I talk about. Either way, it's not showing me what was seen there. But watch what happens if I go back to our terminal, and we change the service type. So let's exit from that pod, new pod. So let's edit the service. So what did I call this? Oh, I didn't call this. I didn't give the service a name, so it's going to get the default name for the pod. So let's edit service Nginx. That should be the one. And sure enough, it is. And let's just search for type. And there it is, cluster IP. Watch this. I'm going to change this to node port. It's got to be a capital P. This is Vim, so I'm just doing WQ. Now let's get the services, and we'll see node port. But we'll see something else important as well. So you can see it's no longer a cluster IP, right? It's no longer a cluster IP. It is now a node port. And look, 30,721. Look at that. So that's saying that on this node, it's going to expose it at that static port. So, without further ado, let's go and see if it's telling the truth. Let's go back to our Vivaldi. Now, we saw we had nothing there before. And does somebody remember that? See, here's one of the problems, node ports right off the bat. Do you remember that off the top of your head? No, I don't either. So let's just do that. It's 30,721. Imagine you have hundreds of websites and you have to remember, obviously not going to be very good. I just copied and pasted it. Let's just paste it in there. And Look at that. Welcome to Nginx. So this is exactly the same thing we saw with the curl command when we were inside the other pod, but now it's being exposed, okay? So there you go. All right, for the third type, this is a little bit different in the sense that you need to have a load balancer, which I don't have. If you had one, like if I was using Metal LB inside my cluster, I could, or if I was in a cloud instance, I would be able to, but I can't here. So let's just do this. Let's change it and I'll show you what will happen. So right now you see it's a node port type, and we're just gonna change that to load balancer. Go over here. Balancer. Okay, I'm going to save it. This will do it on the fly. So now when I look at services, what will I see? I'll see something different. I'll see external IP address pending. And why is it pending? Well, it's pending because it's asked for an external IP address, but there's no load balancer to give it one. So it doesn't have one, obviously. But as you can see, if we did have a load balancer, it would get that external IP address, be one of my network IP addresses, and I'd be able to access it. Okay, so that's how that works. CNAME, again, an external service that I want to see from inside. You can use the external name service for that. So those are the 4 types of services. And obviously there's another way which you can expose applications, which much more often you want to use is ingress. I'm going to make a separate show about that. That's it for this week. I just want to give you an overview of services and what they are and how you can play with them. And we'll come back next week. Next week, I will put on 2 pairs of socks, so I will not have a runny nose after doing my exercises. It's not too bad, though. I'm making it sound a lot more dramatic than it is. All right, we'll see you next week on the Kube Vanguard. Bye-bye.